So you had the successful repeal of the Stamp Act, and after that, you see a few years of relative peace and calm, and even a brief period of diminishing tensions between the colonies and Parliament. But of course, the empire itself still faced this condition of economic bankruptcy, and they needed to act upon that. And you see this new finance minister who is in charge. His name is Charles Townsend, and this will result in the Townsend duties. And of course, he's tasked with that responsibility of raising some kind of revenue. So his strategy when it came particularly to the colonies in North America, well, he was fully aware of the controversy that surrounded the Stamp Act. So he had to kind of act delicately. He knew he didn't want to cause a reaction of anger, and what he did is pass taxation that was considered external taxation. And in particular, he levied these taxes upon English imports that were traditionally purchased by the colonials for years. These were not necessarily luxury goods, so to say, but more finished goods, everyday finished goods like paper and lead and glass, mirrors, silk, tea, and so on. And of course, Townsend's rationale was, well, the colonials have purchased the stuff for decades, and therefore we could still depend on the colonials to purchase them. And we just add a tax on there, a sales tax, and that's an external tax. So this should not arouse any controversy. So assumed Townsend, of course. Okay, so as stated, he considered it very important that his duties, Townsend duties, were indeed external taxes. But here's the thing. At this point, from the colonial perspective, a few years after the Stamp Act crisis, now, to be honest, at first the reaction to the Townsend duties was relatively mild compared to that of the Stamp Act. But you see it growing and growing in controversy. You see more and more resentment build up over this added tax. And you also see this conspiratorial mindset held by many colonials that Parliament was targeting the colonies in particular. In today's language, we could use the term conspiracy theory, right? By the way, historians writing, even in the 20th century, 21st century, have discussed how conspiracy theory circulated through the colonies during the colonial crisis leading up to the revolution. These theories were basically conspiracies that supposedly explained why these taxes were being implemented upon the colonials after 150 years of basically hands-off approach, right, prior to 1763. All right, so in other words, let's remember that Townsend did not expect any condemnation issuing from the colonials towards his plan or his act because they were all external taxes. And let's remember the Stamp Act Congress again. They did not mind external taxes in their argument. What was unacceptable to the Stamp Act Congress were direct taxes or internal taxes. So Townsend's duties, once again, were all external taxes. They're all related to that transatlantic trade system. So the colonial response, however, was not one of resignation or acceptance. Rather, it became an explosive issue. And again, this is aided by the fact that these various conspiracy theories circulated as to why Parliament was oppressing them, the colonials, with this tax. And again, why would the colonials respond in such a manner when external taxes in principle were considered acceptable? Well, by this time, here's the answer to the question. By this time, the colonials no longer thought that the distinction between external taxation and internal taxation was important. It no longer mattered in their minds. Okay, so the argument applied in the past with the Stamp Act, um, well, that no longer applies with the Townshend duties, basically. So we see another act of attempted taxation, and in the colonial mindset, it was believed that Parliament was, again, basically targeting unfairly the colonials in the task to rescue the English treasury from their bankruptcy. And moreover, they felt that the Townshend duties were there to control their consumption habits, right? The colonial consumption habits. Let's remember that economic freedom was something that the colonials enjoyed practically since the beginning of settlement in the early 1600s, right? Economic freedom, the right to consume as they please. There's our key idea here, consumerism. And yeah, they consumed what they wanted, whether it was French tea or English tea during the 7 Years' War, if you recall. Despite the Navigation Acts, despite mercantilist policies and what have you. So again, the notion that England was trying to control their consumption habits circulated widely, and you add that with the fact that, they thought that they were being unfairly targeted to replenish the treasury of the royal treasuries, if you will. So eventually, you see the publication of a well known political tract published by this important figure, John Dickinson, titled The Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Now, it should be mentioned that John Dickinson would eventually become one of the important founding fathers by the time of the Revolution in 1775, 76. But also, it needs to be mentioned that he's not just your average yeoman farmer. He's actually wealthy. He's an elite, right? A colonial elite. So, Dickinson's argument, it actually follows a very elegant, if you will, elegant logical path. So, in the study of logic, this is called a syllogism, where it's comprised, an argument that is, it's comprised of premises that flow from one to the next, leading uh, logically to a conclusion, right? So let's examine this premise one here. And again, this is Dickinson's main argument. He states here that we can't be truly happy if we are not free. So everyone who's reading this has to agree with premise one before you move on to premise two, right? Notice that he used the term happy. This is a preoccupation or a focus with many Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers at that time. Let's remember that in the Declaration of Independence, there'll be the term, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, structurally, if you look at this, it's saying if A, then B, right? If we are not free, then we can't be truly happy, right? So, therefore, we move to premise two. We can't be free if we're not secure in our property. So, do we agree that this flows from premise one? That being free definitely involves being secure in our property, meaning, we own our property and no one could take it away, right? So if we agree with that, then we can see how, if A leads to B, then B leads to C here in premise two. Premise three goes on with this logic. We can't be secure in our property if it's taken away without our consent. So does everyone agree with that, right? Well, if you do, then you agree that premise one flows to premise two, which flows logically to premise three. Another way to say that is if A, then B, then the next step is if B, then C, and then if C, then D, right? So the conclusion is, the duties, Townshend's duties, are taking away our property without consent. Therefore, we cannot be free and happy. Okay, so this is a logical argument against the Townshend duties. Now, this seems like a really nice argument, but let's look at a different argument found in Dickinson's political work. And it goes like this. Premise one: if we are taxed without our consent, then it is a violation of our liberty. So, again, if you're taxing us, if it's a coercive tax, then you are taking away our liberty or our freedom, right? Or you're infringing upon our liberty. Premise two: if we have no freedom or liberty, then we are slaves, right? And if you look at that, well, that's the exact definition of a slave, someone who has no freedom. So perhaps one could be persuaded to agree with premise two. So the logical flow here leads to a conclusion. Let's go back to premise one. If A, then B, right? And then premise two, if B is correct, then C. Therefore, if A, then C, right? If we are being taxed without our consent, we are slaves. So it's interesting to note how he invokes this condition of slavery, right? And if the Townsend duties are imposed without our consent, well, guess what? They are slaves, according to Dickinson. Okay. So we could certainly critique that, of course, because we know who the real slaves are. In this scenario, well, they're found on Dickinson's plantation, right? Or many of the other founders, practically all of them, they had slaves, right? So those are the real slaves. So you could definitely critique this as being a slippery slope argument, right? That, we could say there's a false dichotomy here saying if we have no freedom, then we are slaves. Is that true, right? It is if you're going by mere definition, but there's a lot more subtleties, right, that could basically contest this flow from if in this case, if B then C, right? Does B lead to C, or is B or does C naturally follow from B, right? In premise two, one could argue against that, right? And again, Dickinson is using the term slave and applying it to the elite colonials. Now, with Dickinson's political work gaining popularity, you see the colonial populations, especially on the seaboard, it should be mentioned. These important cities like Philadelphia and Boston, they're ports for receiving English goods into the colonies. And you see the colonials acting swiftly in the attempt to repudiate the Townsend duties. And there's going to be two particular ways that they do this. Number one was to issue what was called non-consumption agreements, right? Non-consumption acts or non-consumption agreements. And related to this was something called non-importation agreement. So what were these agreements? Well, the non-consumption agreements is exactly how it sounds. It's basically an agreement among the colonials not to consume English goods, right? Not to purchase them. It's a boycott, essentially. Especially those goods that are part of Townsend's duties. Let's recall, everyday goods like glass and mirrors and silk and tea. The idea is this. Well, let's not buy any of these English goods, and that way it'll prevent Parliament from getting their money from us. And related to this was non-importation. Basically, one way of enforcing non-importation was to literally prevent English ships carrying cargo of finished goods, right, to prevent them from docking on colonial ports. And by the way, if you're an English ship and you do dock in a colonial port, well, you're automatically demanding the tax to be paid right away upon unloading those items and returning to England. So if you're a colonial, you could prevent those English ships, not to give them permission, right? Prevent those English ships from docking as a means to prevent them from collecting the tax.